Meantime, want to bring in our resident doctor who's been listening in on this conversation as well with some of his thoughts on what Bill Gates had to say. Joining us right now is former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He's also a CNBC contributor, serves on the board of Pfizer and Illumina, and we get our daily check-in with the doctor. It's nice to see you. Listening to Bill Gates, Bill, to me at least, seemed both optimistic, but also maybe a realist in terms of just how long it's going to take to get the world back to some semblance of normal. Are you more optimistic or more pessimistic, you think, Doctor, right now?
I think what he said was fairly on target. I think that activity will restore in the fall, but there's going to be a drag on the economy and a drag on activity as this continues to circulate in the fall and we face the risk of outbreaks and perhaps another epidemic. One of the things that Gates is doing very effectively with respect to the vaccine and the therapeutics is focusing on their manufacturing. So we may have an effective drug in the fall, and I've talked about that a lot on the show, that we need an effective therapeutic. But we're not going to have the capacity to produce it at scale to give it to the millions of people who might be eligible for it, might need it. Gates has been focused on that issue, so his foundation's been doing some good work around that. How are we going to make these things at the enormous scale that's going to be required, not just to provide a benefit here in the U.S., but a global benefit?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. And you've made the point on this program before. With SARS, we never found a vaccine, for example. Why are we more confident that we're going to be able to find a vaccine this time around?
Well, we didn't try very long to make a SARS vaccine. SARS, as you remember, went away, and a lot of the therapeutic development that was underway to try to target SARS sort of fell off. Same with MERS. People are optimistic that this is a pathogen that we can make a vaccine against. But that said, we've never made a vaccine against a coronavirus before, so there's a lot of things we don't understand. Probably the vaccine is going to need to be given maybe on an annual basis. It's not going to give an enduring immunity. You're going to need a booster perhaps as much as annually. Also, the platforms that are being used to develop this vaccine are very novel themselves. So when we make the flu vaccine, we have a tried and true platform that we understand real well. Here, the platforms that are being used, like the RNA platform that Bill Gates talked about, that's very novel. And so you're stacking risk, you're stacking uncertainty, if you will. You're developing a vaccine against a target that you've never drugged before. You've never made a vaccine against a coronavirus. And then you're using platforms that you've never used before to make a vaccine. And that's why I think this is going to take longer than a year. I think as a base case, if we're making estimates on where we're going to be, I think we need to assume it's going to take 2 years. We may get one sooner than that, but we need to figure out how do we get through at least 2 years with coronavirus circulating in the world before we get to a vaccine and can mass inoculate people. I mean, we might have a vaccine before then for certain groups, but in terms of when we're ready to mass inoculate the population, that could be a while.
But clearly, your focus and Bill's focus has been also on the antiviral, and just how much optimism should we have around that? Because it seems to me that if you see where the stock market is today, there is a big bet that the world is back to normal in the fall. That there isn't a reinfection. Not only is there not a reinfection, there isn't an anxiety among people to go back to some semblance of normal.
Right,
which you've been warning about.
And Bill talked about having, and Bill talked about having an antiviral or a drug that was very effective in order to restore some sense of normalcy. I think if we just have a couple of drugs that are effective but maybe not home runs, they don't need to be a cure, that's going to be enough to really meaningfully impact the pathogenesis of this disease and reduce, I think, a lot of the anxiety and concern and maybe the morbidity and mortality associated with this disease. And so he talked about the therapeutic antibodies. I think that's high on the list. There's a couple of antivirals that are far along. You really need to look at what can be available in the fall. There's a lot of drugs, and many look very promising, but they're a longer way off. In terms of what could be available by August, there's really a small subset, and I would put the antibodies at the top of that list.
So that subset, and then there's the manufacturing issue, which Bill's also working so diligently on, in terms of how quickly that could get rolled out, or at least at some semblance of scale, so that populations that are more susceptible would be able to have access to them. What's your expectation? And I'm also, in terms of that timeline, why is August? I mean, I understand we all want August because we want the world to come back, but is that the timeline that it looks like all of these drugs are on to be tested and ready?
No, that's the timeline that we need. Really, we need it right now, but we're not going to have it right now. There's not going to be drugs available in the next 4 weeks to help the people who are dying right now from this disease, and it's awful. But we need something by August, in my view, because when we come back in September and kids go back to school and college campuses restart and people start going back into indoor spaces and feel a little bit complacent about this coming off of July and August, I think we'll be quiescent here. The risk is going to explode in terms of this virus having a furtive risk of creating another outbreak or epidemic in the country, so that we need it by then. In terms of the scale on the manufacturing, if you look at the companies who are making these antibodies, I would say that we could potentially get to 1 million doses a month with respect to these antibodies. So it's not a lot. You're not going to have enough to mass inoculate the population if it can be used prophylactically or use it in everyone. It's going to probably be reserved for people who are either at high risk of getting the virus, so you prophylax them, or people who come into the emergency room with the virus and are at high risk of a bad outcome, and you give them a dose early on. But for a lot of other people, it's probably not going to be available.
Right. Doctor, the other question I just wanted to ask you is less related to what Bill had to say, and more related to actually what some of our viewers have been saying. Oftentimes when you come on and they say, you know, I live in a place, I don't live in New York City, I live in a place maybe in the Midwest, maybe somewhere else. I can go to work and stay 6 feet away from people. Why can't I just do that? And a great frustration. People even talk about it in the context of their own liberty and their own freedom. Speak to that issue and how you think about that.
Well, look, I think it's eminently reasonable that different parts of the country take a different approach to this virus, because not everyone faces the same risk. A dense urban environment with a lot of travel in and out faces a lot different risk than a rural environment. And so I think different parts of the country need to adjust what they do to try to mitigate this risk. But what I would say about that right now is that we don't know where the risk is. If we had a good surveillance system, we were testing, we knew where this virus was spreading, different parts of the country could take different measures and relax some of these measures based on an assumption and a knowledge that the virus really wasn't spreading in their community. But I think every part of the country really is at risk right now. People who say, well, it's not spreading in my community probably don't know.